Donald Trump's presidential campaign has undoubtedly polarized the country, well, at least just a tad more than it was already. And his presidency has most definitely not done anything in the way of easing the tense atmosphere in America. To many, the Republican Party in general represents the prejudices present in the United States which keep the country divided by race. Hey, that rhymes. By class, by religion, and by social value. But are they getting a bad rap? There is a faction within the right that may, in fact, not be bigoted assholes. In a 1936 speech, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt coined the phrase economic royalists to describe the prominent persons in finance and industry opposed to the idea of a more centralized government in competition with private enterprise. Economic royalists are advocates of social privileges and political power through wealth. Though FDR came up with this catchy phrase, the concept is nothing new. America, though it applauds itself as being land of the free, a divorce from the aristocratic rule of Europe, but in many ways, America has always been an aristocracy. Another very old idea was religious elitism. You know, through moral values. Do you remember the Pilgrims? Yes, Puritanism, the Joe Heismans of intolerance, responsible for the deaths of countless women in New England. America has changed over the years, from the rugged agrarian society of the colonies to the gentrified modern cities indicative of globalization. And with every milestone, there is always someone who liked it better the way it was before. And this ragtag band of Bible thumpers, gun enthusiasts, neo Confederates, and those who believe in the conservation of America's most prized parchment in its most technical sense make up what we call the right wing. The role of economic royalists has been in part to streamline the message of the collective so the movement can win elections and provide a lot of funding. So, what makes these people gravitate to the Republican Party? Well, it's simple. Nobody likes big government. And for the libertarians, the problem with big government is it tends to help the wrong people. We'll get into that. Those predisposed to find libertarianism attractive are also more likely to be seduced by the alt right. To them, libertarianism may lose its appeal when they discover the alt right may offer a more outrageous ideology to embrace. Like libertarianism on steroids. Well, at least the kind that doesn't make you strong. Behind this worldview, which at times is totally historically inaccurate, is the misplaced affinity for the Confederacy. To some libertarians, war tends to increase the growth of government, and some libertarians note that the federal government grew during the Civil War. This leads some to the terribly mistaken conclusion that the Confederacy was somehow the more libertarian side in the conflict. This idea is reinforced by revisionist historical accounts that try to claim the war was really over tariffs, a claim which used to be taught in some high school textbooks, especially in the South. On March 2nd, 1861, the Morrill Tariff was signed into law by outgoing Democratic President James Buchanan. A lie was quickly formed around the tariff's passage, a lie suggesting that somehow the tariff had caused the U.S. Civil War. The problem with that narrative is the Morrill Tariff bill could have easily been defeated in the Senate had the Southern statesmen not resigned from their offices. The tariff became law because of Southern secession. So, who are the authors of this historical fabrication? Well, to answer that, it would be important to note that the Confederacy was dependent on assistance from Europe. Though the South did trade cotton to Britain, and some munitions slipped in by small blockade runners, they were operated and funded by British private interests and not officially sanctioned by the Crown, which was legal under international law. Though there were discussions in France and Britain of assisting the Confederacy, they did not commit, and Confederate trade with Europe also waned as the war continued. Sorry, guys. In the UK, support for the American Civil War was divided by class lines.
The wealthy overall supported the South, while everyone else was against slavery. But as we spoke about before, if you want to get people to support your cause, a favored go-to method is, of course, to bend the truth. And thus the moral tariff myth was created, the brainchild of Southern agents in Britain seeking to win over the people of London. A London Times editorial pronounced that the protection was quite as much a cause of disruption of the Union as slavery, and remarked how the moral tariff had much changed the tone of public feeling in favor of the secessionists. There are some who believe that when Southern decision-makers mentioned slavery in public prior to secession and the declarations of state legislatures just might have been propaganda, designed to appeal to the common denominator of Southern opinion. Yeah, this all sounds really good. What they're saying is that the Southern states would use slavery, which if abolished would impact 9% of those Southerners who actually own slaves, more than the poor majority who could have benefited from abolition. Now, this sounds insane. How would white Southerners benefit from abolition? Well, they could have capitalized on the demand for labor. Possibly. Though there was a social hierarchy in America, especially in the South, which puts blacks at the absolute bottom, all whites may have benefited from slavery socially. 95% of Southerners could not afford a slave, which cost more than some Southerners made in a lifetime. No, it would have made more sense to use the moral tariff argument to galvanize poor whites against the North, considering they were affected by tariffs more, since they were restricted to where they could sell their crops, and also limited as to where they could buy needed goods. No, poor people fight over pockets, not principles. Tariffs would have been more a suitable idea to rally behind. Hey, it worked in the Revolutionary War. The bottom line is, the argument that the Civil War was about anything other than slavery, at least from the perspective of the Confederacy, is total and utter and completely bullshit. Southern leaders were, and I quote, killing to spread slavery and bragging of it since 1856. Now that doesn't sound like the rhetoric of one would hear from supporters of states' rights at all, does it? Do you remember when we talked about Kansas and the corruption? All one would have to do is research David Rice Atchison and his part in the Bleeding Kansas incident. The pro-slavery states had no problem ignoring the will of the people of Kansas who voted 95% against slavery. Jefferson Davis himself said the resistance to spread slavery in Kansas was an intolerable grievance. The slavery issue did not keep England from entering the war on the side of the Confederacy. It was threats by Russia, who said they would declare war on England if they did. This was due to the work of Ambassador Cassius Clay, a former slave owner himself, who was candidate for presidency when Lincoln won. Lincoln awarded Clay with the ambassadorship for supporting him in the convention. Yes, before you ask, former slave of Cassius M. Clay named his son after former slave owner, and his grandson was named after his father until he converted to Islam and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. So the late Muhammad Ali did in fact get rid of his slave name when he joined the Nation of Islam. Fun fact. Anyway, the popular right narrative of the Civil War, which has mobilized a couple hundred white nationalists to join forces against the recent dismantling of the Confederate hero fantasy, this miseducation of the hillbilly that inspired a Naugatuck, Connecticut police officer to go on a racist rant while cyberbullying a white mother of interracial children. Did I mention that Connecticut is in the North? I mean the really, really North. They say the history is told by the victor, except for in the case of the Civil War, where it's more like arguing with a bitchy girlfriend that will totally ignore the fact that they were wrong. It's like this uncanny ability to make it everyone else's fault. Isn't that what the right says about everybody else? Gee. And as this false narrative has become the driving force behind the far right's ideology, the sovereign citizens movement with the Posse Comitatus, the Tea Party, libertarians, and the alt-right have all taken a dip in this pool of bullshit. Now, if you're wondering who's the culprit, how this happened, all one would have to do is look at Andrew Johnson, the father of Southern apologists. During the Reconstruction, the racial hierarchy of the South was turned on its ear, and over time, perhaps the racial tensions would have been assuaged. But the traitorous Southern leaders were granted amnesty and given their power back to implement a system that in many ways was far worse than slavery: segregation. And through this, they were able to further incriminate the poor whites of the South through the black codes. A white person that didn't participate in disenfranchisement of blacks also became a target, either by social snubbing or in some cases violence. The South, as well as Southern sympathizers, began to teach this revisionist work of art in elementary schools as well as in university. And when a perceived credible source tells a lie, it's more widely accepted. And the longer it remains, the harder it becomes to refute and or detach it from the social consciousness. So this Southern turd was able to spread far and wide. Why were these seeds of stupidity so easily sown in the minds of poor whites, whether in the South or amongst the immigrant population in the North and West? Well, there was this concept, a dream if you will, one that was sold mostly to immigrant populations. You know, bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. And when this dream didn't materialize, someone had to divert the people's attention. Because if we learn from Bacon's Rebellion, when unified groups of poor people are equally disenfranchised, they get together and tear shit up. Freedom and prosperity are viewed as scarce in America. Wealth distribution is a delicate ecosystem. It has to be for 10% of the population to control 90% of its wealth. Any change can possibly push working class families into destitution. After the Civil War, many rich Southern supporters and co-conspirators had their land seized. That land had been redistributed to former slaves, at least until Andrew Johnson gave it back. So if you're wondering what happened to those 40 acres and a mule, yeah. So who was forced to face the brunt of backlash against the South after the Civil War? Since the rich was absolved, the poor white trash, who in fairness were really manipulated and forced to fight the war, considering most of the Confederate infantry had little, if any, stake in the war whatsoever. If we were divvying up this country's wealth, the rich policymakers on either side have never had to give anything up. Think about that. So everybody else fights for a portion of the 5% of the country's wealth. This is where the central government steps in to help divide the scraps. What proponents of this argument tend to forget, that the central government expansion was a reaction. Now I know this may upset a few. I know your great-great-grandparents were soldiers in the Civil War, and they were war heroes, or considered that way at least below the Mason-Dixon line. I know this is challenging for you. I know what the school books taught you. But let's deal with facts. Pro-slave states used an erroneous and historically inaccurate argument to deny a group of Americans access to the protections of the Constitution. And when the central government stepped in, they complained about constitutional violations. Today, our ideological blinders have become blindfolds, and we have totally missed the truth, in which pretty much everything that you accept is in fact bullshit. Here's another paradox. The Nazis were socialists and fascists. The Confederates were anti-American, not just because of the idea of slavery. What the Confederates wanted to do was to force the rest of the states didn't have slaves. So had slavery become legal, they would have had the source. Slaves were being bred in the South. They would have been able to sell slaves all over the country. That was the big picture. Now, going back to the Revolutionary War, in discussion of the Confederate flag, the symbology of the Confederate flag is a Union Jack. It's a Union Jack, which is the symbol of England. These Confederates used an opportunity to force the United States to break the Constitution. I want you to understand that. But what does this have to do with nerds? It's interesting because when we look at the alt-right, they are viewed as a millennial movement. In fact, their imagery is that of an internet troll. No, the alt-right would not exist were it not for the Revenge of the Nerds. You see, the nerds believed in freedoms. They believed and liberties. And they took some. They stood up for the little guy, the one who gets picked on, forgotten. This is how the alt-right views themselves. As the underdog. Though it sounds ironic that a group of white guys are claiming to be the underdog, in that pesky history of slavery and Jim Crow and Japanese internment camps and treatment of Latin Americans and the Opium Wars, the Shanghai, the railroads, and treating women kind of shitty for a couple hundred years. So sometimes that charming, dry sarcasm falls on deaf ears. Thanks for listening and clicking the like. Anyway, you have a good night, a good day, whatever.